You might have thought I was joking, but I'm really going to sew a book with the sewing machine. If you look hard enough, you'll find comments by me on the interweb saying this is a really bad idea. So what's changed? Why am I doing this? Well, you'll have to stick around to find out. I have been negative about sewing books with the sewing machine, that is, not a section sewer, arguing that it's like adding the perforations to a book designed to have pieces torn out of it, like tickets or stamps. I was reading this little booklet by J.K. called Bookbinding for Beginners, and as I always do, I checked out how it was bound. I was very surprised to see it was sewn with a sewing machine. This type of sewing is not uncommon in commercial work. It's usually used for cheap and ephemeral work, and it's usually side sewn. But here it is, used for a book on bookbinding, and after 90 years the pages haven't torn out. Maybe it's worth looking at. First, let's work out how the K-book is made. Obvious features are the outer textured paper cover designed to look like cloth that's laminated to the outer sheet of the single-section pamphlet. In between the laminations, at the spine, is a guard, almost certainly cloth, that is about 1/2 inch wide at front and back. Since the sewing is not visible on the outside of the book is sewn, including the guard, and then covered in the red material. I would assume the cloth guard is to stop the sewing pulling through the paper, strengthening the text to cover attachment. And it's obviously worked as the book is still in fully functioning condition. Kay's book is 48 pages long, which results in 12 sheets of paper. This is more sheets of paper than I like in a single section pamphlet. Would my sewing machine even sew through this many sheets? My new PDF book project is just under 60 pages long, even worse. But the Tale of Squirrel Nutkin it is. Fingers crossed. I printed the book on the thinnest paper I have that the images will look okay on. I'm using 80 GSM short grain A5 reflex copier paper. This was the last high quality copier paper made in Australia until the production line was shut down earlier this year by its foreign owner. This resulted in the tariff on imported copier paper being scrapped, since you don't have to protect a non-existent industry, which also allowed the same foreign owner to import copier paper from its Asian mills at a lower cost. Do you think the price of paper dropped for consumers? Anyway, I digress. Most A5 copier paper is short-grained, as is any US letter paper cut in half. You can follow along with the paper which is easily available near you. Before I forget, I need to add an outer blank sheet which the cover will be laminated to. I'm going to sew the book before folding it, thus I need the cloth hinge now. I'm going to make mine a bit wider, 1 inch or 25 millimeters front and back. I want to hold it in place with paper clips, but I don't want the paper clips this close to the sewing, so I cut a piece of starched cotton half the width of the book plus the width of the hinge. I also make it a bit longer so I can start and finish sewing off the book. I clip this in place and I'm ready to sew. After a number of failed attempts, I decide I need a guide to sew in a straight line exactly down the middle of the book. I temporarily tape a strip of board in place and then secure it with double-sided tape. I start with some test runs, which I recommend you do too if you're following along. First, I want to see how much paper my machine will handle. The machine needs to handle 16 sheets plus the cloth hinge. I set the stitch length to as long as the machine will do, and I position the machine right on the edge of the bench so I can use the control pedal on the floor instead of having it balanced badly on a shelf. I also test out using the guide board. I want to apologise to all the sewing machine experts out there. Now you know how I feel about most of the bookbinding videos on the internet. I have been using a sewing machine for a long time, but neat, straight lines have never been a priority for me. My machine is fairly new, as my wife's Janome drowned in the flood 2 years ago. It says heavy duty, but I don't remember it being anything special. It was on sale, and a young bloke that has a sewing YouTube channel recommended it. He's worth checking out if you want to learn how to sew. Moment of truth. I couldn't show you my first attempt as it contained inappropriate language. It was perfect until the last couple of inches when I veered to port. The third attempt was acceptable and fourth perfect. I even tried a larger sheet size. The guide didn't work for this, and I ended up ruling a very faint guideline. It wasn't perfect, but acceptable. My observation is that it's hard to sew a very straight line well away from an edge. Even slight deviations, which wouldn't be noticed in sewing cloth, are noticeable once the book is folded. It was stressful and difficult. After sewing, I folded the section along the sewing line and pressed it. If you don't have a press, just put it under a heavy weight and leave it an hour or so. If you don't have a sewing machine or don't want to deal with the stress, you can still make this book by just using the simple 5-hole pamphlet sewing technique. I think for hand bookbinding, this is a much better option. It's just as strong without the tearaway perforation line and a lot less stressful. In this case, we need to fold the section before sewing. With 16 sheets of paper, there's going to be a lot of paper creep around the fold. I use the trick of knocking up the paper and then lifting the stack until it's vertical and pinching it and lowering it. This fans out the sheets slightly. Now when I fold the section, the creep on the outer sheets is roughly distributed between the front and back. When pinched together, the foredge should be sort of pointy. It usually takes a couple of goes to get this as even as I want. Just punch 5 holes, one in the centre, one at each end about 15 millimetres or half an inch in, and another between the end holes and the centre hole. I don't bother measuring and just use my judgment for placement. Sew as usual and tie off in the centre. If you need detailed instructions for this sewing, check out one of my pamphlet binding videos. Back to the machine sewn books. I can trim the cloth guard by using the width of my ruler, which is 25mm, and then I glue the guard down to the outer sheet and put some glue on the spine to lock the sewing thread in place. This is why I don't need to back sew at the ends. I let this dry for an hour or so. Instead of covering with the textured paper, I'm using Chelsea book cloth. It's lightweight and has the advantage that I can print on it. I experimented with laminating the Chelsea with the copier paper, and if I glued the paper, the pull was fairly strong and the result was a curled laminate. But if I glued the cloth, it ended up flat. I don't use paperback cloths much, and I forgot to take into consideration the paper grain direction of the backing paper. I'd cut it so the grain direction was what you would normally consider wrong, but it stretches very little. I assume because it's attached to the cloth, it constrains it. Bottom line is that I glued out the cloth to put the text into the cover. I did one side, then the other. I found rolling the text onto the cloth worked well. Pulling the cloth over the text also worked, but you end up with sticky fingers and more likely to get glue on the book. I'll let it dry under some light weight. I didn't bother with fences or blotters. The PVA is fairly dry and the moisture will work its way out eventually. I'll repeat this demonstration on the larger book too. The final step is trimming the edges. These are thick enough that trimming with a knife and ruler would be challenging, so I use the guillotine since I have one. With some care, you should be able to trim this book with a knife, as it's only about 1/4 of an inch thick. Was it worth it? I don't think it is. I think sewing a simple 5-hole pamphlet stitch is less stressful and just as fast once you include the setup time for the sewing machine. It's interesting to look at my wife's copy of Squirrel Nutkin from when she was little. It was side sewn using a sewing machine, and this is why it opens so poorly. I completed the first book I sewed just so I could destroy it. It was stronger than expected. The pages did tear along the sewing at the spine easier than just tearing paper. Eventually this would be the failure point, but the attachment to the cover was surprisingly strong and significant force was needed to rip it out. It's not a technique I'm going to be using much, but it was more interesting and robust than I expected. The K books must be out of copyright as the PDFs are available on the Internet Archive and the link's in the description. You can bind your own copy of the sewing machine. The PDF I've made for Squirrel Nutkin is available for $6 plus app fees and the link is also in the description. I've included impositions and cover art to match Peter Rabbit so you can bind it using the sewing board technique to make a matching pair. I might do Benjamin Bunny yet. I hope you found today's video interesting, if not useful. Until next time, cheerio.